Hello all and welcome. My name is Margaret. I'm a historical costumer and textile conservator in training. And today we have a video that I feel like I need to make in order to send to everybody who ever asks me this question. When I, say, hello, my name is Margaret, I'm a textile conservator, the next question is inevitably, what is a textile conservator? And sometimes, what is a textile? And I have to approach the situation very different based on the question that this person's asking me. But what is a textile conservator? Very common question. Not something that I dock people for not knowing because, what is a textile conservator? That's a great question. And writing this script, I actually had a decent time trying to figure that out for myself, even though I do textile conservation on a day-to-day basis. We're going to define art conservation and also textile conservation. We're going to talk a little bit about it. And this is actually going to be a 4-part series. So the first episode of this is going to be what is art conservation? Then we are going to talk about how one becomes an art conservator, what the education for that looks like, and also sort of the pros and cons of the career. Then I will be talking about my personal art conservation journey up until now. I'm in grad school if you don't know. And then if there is interest, I will be doing a Q&A about art conservation, how to become an art conservator, my art conservation journey, anything that relates to these 3 videos. So if you do have questions for me, you can pop them down below. I'll also be asking on my Instagram, which you can follow at costumeandconservation. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you want to learn more about art conservation. What is art conservation? According to ICOMCC, another acronym, I know. What does ICOMCC stand for? According to ICOMCC, which stands for the International Council of Museums Committee for Conservation, conservation is all measures and actions aimed at safeguarding tangible cultural heritage while ensuring its accessibility to present and future generations. Conservation embraces preventive conservation, remedial conservation, and restoration. All measures and actions should respect the significance and physical properties of the cultural heritage item. So that's a lot and encompasses a lot of different things. The definition I normally use to tell people is that conservation professionals are the steward of the physical properties of cultural heritage. So we deal with, keeping it in a safe environment and making sure it's not physically falling apart. However, there's also the 3-legged stool approach, which we normally use. Many conservation professionals describe conservation as this, quote, 3-legged stool, which combines connoisseurship, art history, hand skills, and scientific knowledge. So those are kind of like the 3 things at which conservation stands on. So those are sort of the definitions of the field. In essence, it is protecting cultural heritage in a very active and proactive way, a very tangible manner. But what does that actually mean? So let's do a short little history of the field. Conservation of artistic and historic works really began to be an actual career and field of study in around the 1920s in both Europe and the United States, starting out mostly in the field of paintings conservation. However, all of the different subspecialties, which we will touch on, sort of start in different places. Textile conservation really comes out of this background of textile care, so like laundry and mending. It sort of comes out of that and sort of gets swallowed into this more scientific field that is conservation. Painting conservation, objects conservation, they sort of come in. The first training programs in the US are started in the mid-century, in the 60s and the 70s. Some of the programs in the UK and Europe are a little older than that. You really start to see a lot of museum jobs and departments opening in the 80s, and it sort of has progressed until today. So that's kind of where we're at with the field. That's very short, that's very broad. The history of conservation isn't something that has been studied a lot, but there are people working on the history of conservation as we speak. So hopefully I can give you more details about that in the future. So let's talk about what kind of conservators are out there. First, there's kind of like where conservators work and what specialties conservators are. So let's start with where conservators work. Conservators are broadly broken down into 3 different types of jobs that they do. So we have museum conservators. These are people who are employed by a museum or a state institution or a historical society who work for that specific institution, work on their objects, and have their lab housed within the institution. So like, say the Met they have a crap ton of conservators. They have the most conservators probably in the US, I would say. They have their conservation department. All those conservators work for the Met. They work on Met objects. Then you have regional labs, they're called. And these are labs in big cities that will take on projects for smaller institutions throughout their region that don't have conservation labs. So an example of this is MAC, which is the Midwest Art Conservation Center. They are semi-affiliated with the Minneapolis Institute of Art. They share space with the Minneapolis Institute of Art, but they aren't part of that institution. They're their separate own thing, and they service institutions, smaller museums throughout the Midwest region. Then of course there are private conservators, which are people who run their own businesses. They work with small institutions. They might take on contract jobs for bigger institutions that even have their own conservators, and they will also do work for private clients. Regional labs sometimes also do work for private clients, but normally private conservators will. Private conservators, it can just be one person, or they can have a bigger lab, but they are normally not like associated directly with an institution. It's kind of the difference between regional labs and private conservation gets a little bit fuzzy, but it's mostly like if you're a single Pringle, or it's just like two people, you're a private conservator. Whereas if you are a larger consortium of conservators, especially if you're affiliated with a specific institution, but you're not under their umbrella, you can be a regional lab. So those are the kind of three types of conservators classified by like where they work. Now we need to talk about the categorization of specialties. So art conservation is broadly broken down by 4 specialties: book and paper, paintings, objects, and textiles. So within those categories, there's a range of subcategories. You can be a specialist, or you can be a generalist. There are conservators, object conservators, who work on a variety of different types of objects. Object, by the way, is anything that is not book, paper, a painting, or a textile, and sometimes they are those too. I always joke that object conservators work on everything anybody else doesn't want to work on. They like a challenge, okay? They're adventurous people. So within the objects conservation field, there's a lot of subsets. There's people who only work on metals. There's people who only work on glass. There are specific furniture conservators, and they're kind of almost outside the realm of objects. There are people who only work on wooden objects. There are arms and armor conservators. There are people who only work on contemporary art. So there are kind of different subsections of that. Within textiles, we have just sort of general textiles. Tapestry is kind of its own thing. Costume is its own thing for the most part. And then also upholstery, which sort of crosses over the furniture conservator world. Book and paper, you've got library conservators who work on books, but also different kinds of archival material. You have people who just work with works on paper. You have Asian art conservators, which kind of come from a separate tradition. They come from a normally East Asian background. Very interesting, very different from a lot of conservation work. And I will put links in the description to different East Asian conservation labs of the United States. They're super cool. Time-based media conservators who work with sort of the digital stuff and movies and that kind of thing, and then photography conservators as well. Within the paintings field, you have people who work on easel paintings, you have people who work on painted surfaces, you have architectural conservators.
We of course can't forget about preventive conservation, which is an important and emerging field within conservation at large, and also conservation scientists, which help with scientific research and analysis. This list is non-exhaustive, and I certainly forgot somebody, so drop it down in the comments if there is a specialty that I may have missed.
The list goes on and on. You can get as granular as you want. You can get as broad as you want. But generally speaking, in the educational setting, you're going to be doing objects, paintings, book and paper, or textiles. But then again, sometimes programs get a little bit more broken down. So let's talk about education for a hot second. We're going to get into this in the next video, but broadly speaking, to become an art conservator, you do need a graduate degree in art conservation. Traditionally, and in previous years, you could be what's called bench trained, which is when you essentially do apprenticeships in order to become a conservator. There are very, very few conservators left working in institutional settings. that are bench trained to get a job within a regional center or a larger institution, you do need a graduate degree in art conservation. So we'll get into that in a separate video and we can talk all about grad school. It's a wild, wonderful time. So what do art conservators do on a daily basis? So essentially, it depends on sort of where you're working. If you work at an institution that's exhibition driven, your entire day is going to be focused on preparing for those exhibitions or loans. If you work at a private lab, it's obviously driven by private clients. But generally speaking, the process of art conservation is thus. You get an object and you are going to look at the object, see what type of treatment it may need, see what type of mounting it may need, and then you're going to propose a plan of action. You're going to deliver that to your supervisor, your curator, your private client, whoever that is, to get approval. And then you're going to carry out that treatment to stabilize or visually compensate the object in order for it to go on display, go into permanent storage, or go back into the private client's hands. This can entail, wet cleaning or dry cleaning, or doing a patch, or doing an infill. A lot of different types of things. We can get into that. I'm going to be doing some more conservation content on this channel where you can actually see me doing some conservation. And then you're going to write a report. Documentation is very important. Photography report on the item. And then it will go on exhibition or wherever it needs to go. That process might also include analytical testing. There's a lot of different analytical and scientific tools that we use in conservation. Maybe we'll do X-ray fluorescence, XRF for short, to figure out if a certain object has been treated with heavy metal pesticides and know if we have to wear gloves. Maybe we're using a fancy 3D microscope to map paint surfaces. Maybe we are testing the different colors of dye to figure out what they were made out of. Essentially, the analytical testing is to give us data and give our team data in order to really understand these objects better. Conservation also involves some preventive measures as well. We like to monitor the environment to make sure that the temperature and humidity is good for the preservation of the object. Make sure it's not too hot, not too cold, not too wet, not too dry. Make sure that there are no pests invading our spaces, called IPM, Integrated Pest Management. We can talk more about that later. A lot of conservation professionals do this, but there are actually conservators called preventive conservators who specialize in this subject. Conservation is also important for museum outreach, and we help to facilitate groups of people being able to come to see their objects, or even help potentially with repatriation sometimes. And art conservators are often couriers for art. Shout out to Dr. Abigail Chase, our most determined art curator of all time. If you haven't seen my National Treasure video, go watch it. I really enjoyed doing that video. Essentially, we travel with the art, make sure it's doing okay on its journey. We also help install the art in the galleries, and essentially we are just the stewards of the art. We're the ones physically with the art. A lot of the times we're making sure the kids are all right. That's kind of the main part of the job. Granted, also a lot of documentation, also a lot of report writing, a lot of emailing people, a lot of collaboration. There's a ton of things going on in art conservation, but a lot of it is looking at the object, discussing what we should do, doing that treatment, making sure it gets to where it needs to go. That's generally what we do on a day-to-day basis. Hopefully that answers the question of what art conservation is. Now, I also want to touch on a couple of other things before I leave you. First, especially with all the discussion around DEAI and just generally expanding inclusion, conservation professionals are sort of reevaluating who is a conservator. Now, we tend to gatekeep a little bit in our profession, and there are reasons for that, because art conservation is a relatively new field. And there are still a lot of instances of art conservation going very wrong when a trained conservator is not present. But there are a lot of people doing conservation work out there who are not conservators, and they're doing a good job at it. I'm going to put a website down below that was actually developed by one of my professors, so you can kind of explore sort of the expanded definition of art conservation. I also want to touch on the difference between art conservation and art restoration. I'm coming at this from a North American perspective, and In North America, there is a difference between art conservation and art restoration. That is not necessarily true in other parts of the world. Those two terms are used interchangeably in Europe. Those two terms are used interchangeably a lot of other places. However, in America, there is a difference between conservation and restoration. Conservation generally refers to stabilizing an object for display or long-term storage, but not necessarily making it look new. We're very concerned about artistic intent. We're very concerned about not removing any original materials. We're not trying to make it look new. We're not trying to turn back the wheels of time. Our goal is to make sure it is preserved for the future and that the losses and damage aren't distracting. Does that ideal always work in real life? No. Sometimes people want certain things and you just kind of have to pick your battles on that. But generally speaking, conservation is about preserving historic and artistic integrity and not necessarily making something look new and like sprucing it up, generally. Restoration is more along the lines of like making something look new, sprucing it up, restoring it to its former glory. That's kind of how the definitions are in the United States. There are differences. That's not to say restoration is bad. People have different goals for their objects, for their interiors, things like that. You just have to be cognizant of historic worth and importance and everything like that. It's a sticky situation. It's a weird sort of interplay of things. I just wanted to sort of get into that a little bit because there is a difference between what conservators do and our ethics and our methods versus what restoration is in the United States context. Again, in the world at large, those terms are often used interchangeably. So I hope that helped answer what is art conservation. This is gonna be like a 15-20 minute video all about that, but hopefully I answered the question. There you go. So anyway, stick around here for more videos about art conservation. Again, we will have a video on the pros and cons of the career and also how to become an art conservator coming up soon, my art conservation journey. And if you do have questions, pop those down below so that we can do a Q&A if there's enough interest. Otherwise, you can follow me here on YouTube by hitting the subscribe button and liking this video if you did like it. You can, of course, slide over to TikTok and Instagram where I'm at costumeandconservation. You can just have a great day. I'll see you later. Bye.